Hello YouTube. I thought that it would be nice to speak about video games for a change on this channel, as I did originally intend for this channel to focus on both reading and video games, as they're two of my major hobbies at the moment. Thing is, I've made quite a few book-related videos and almost no videos about gaming. So I thought today I would make something gaming related and address one of my favourite genres, which is platforming. Now, before I get into that, I'm going to address the elephant in the room and explain this. Because I'm sure the first thing you've noticed is I look like I've been in quite a nasty fistfight. I haven't. I had a nasty slip in my shower. I fell face first onto the side of my bathtub. It was not nice. Split my nose, bruised all down this cheekbone, entire eye went black. This is days later and it's still this bad. I am genuinely just so thankful that I didn't land a couple of inches lower down, because I'd have knocked out all my teeth. I'd have ended up with broken teeth, probably knocked out my front teeth. That would have been horrific. So, I'm not glad that I look like I've been beaten up, but it could have been so much worse. So I consider it to be an overall positive situation. Anyway, now that that's addressed, I'm going to have to say that every video until this thing heals, which is going to take a couple of weeks. I put off making videos for a few days because it looked that bad. So I want to talk about platforming. Mainly, I want to discuss what makes a platformer in my mind and how I define them, because I am very particular as to what I consider a platformer to be. Now, there are, of course, both 2D and 3D platformers, of which I have a few here to discuss, and we'll go into the 2D platformers first, because they're a little more clear, I would say. The first is what a lot of people are calling Metroidvanias. I hate that term. Most Castlevania games don't follow the Metroidvania style, and Metroid is not especially important or special when it comes to these kinds of platformers. It wasn't the first one to do it. It's not the best one to do it. And the series has largely been mismanaged by Nintendo for the last decade and a half, so really, who cares about Metroid? Like, they've had, 2 good games? So, I'm not including the Prime series, because they're first-person shooters. But yeah, in that vein, we have Shantae. This is Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. There's quite a few Shantae games. I quite enjoy them. They've got a decent amount of exploration. There's a lot of indie games like Time Spinner, which is particularly good. And my all-time favourite, Hollow Knight. Now, I refer to these under the far more accurate and explanatory name of exploration platforms. Because the whole point is you are platforming and you are exploring. That's the definition of the genre. Far more telling than Metroidvania. If you don't know what the Metroid and Castlevania series are, that name is meaningless to you. So someone new to video games, if they hear exploration platformer, they know that, well, okay, it's a game that involves platforming and exploring. That gives them a good idea as to what to expect. I think it's a better name all round. That is one of the more popular forms of platformer today. The other major form of platformer is the linear platformer, though there are a few that are non-linear. Not many, admittedly, but there are a few. A good example of a non-linear platformer is Flint Hook. This is, and again, this is another name that I dislike. This is a roguelike platformer, and that name is so pathetic. Like, roguelike. Oh, like the game Rogue. A game from the early 80s, available on PCs no one you know or have ever met has ever owned. A game that no one you know has ever played. No one watching this has ever played Rogue, and anyone who says they did is lying. Rogue was extremely niche and was played by a few thousand people worldwide. It is one of the most obscure references you can think of to describe what this is, which is a permadeath procedurally generated platform. That's what it is. That's what roguelike means. It means procedurally generated permadeath game. Diablo did that. You could put on permadeath and it was procedurally generated. So, is Diablo a roguelike? No one would call it one. The elements that make a game a roguelike are very tenuous at best, and I do not like the classification for that reason. But this is a fantastic game, and I generally don't like these kinds of games because I find that platformers work better when there is a planned level design. And something like Flint Hook, because it has to procedurally generate the levels every time, can't have a planned level design. Another example would be Spelunky, where the levels are going to be different every time. Rogue Legacy is another one. They're probably way more popular than Flint Hook, though I think Flint Hook is the better game. They are becoming more popular, but I would say the archetypical 2D platformer, the one I've saved for last, is the traditional like mascot platformer, the linear from point A to point B platformer. A good example being anything that involves Sonic the Hedgehog. And there's a few different ways you can go about it. There's tried and tested platformers such as Sonic, Mario, Rayman, the likes, that kind of thing. Then you can go down the retro revival route, which I suppose Sonic Mania is also a retro revival in a way. There have been a lot of things like this. This is Alex Kidd DX. This is a remake of the 8-bit Master System game. And there's a few, like Wonder Boy also had a remake. There's been a few that are just straight ports as well. The Aladdin Lion King collection was also ported over to modern consoles. There's loads like that, where they'll take an old game and just port it straight over to a modern console with just a slight boost to graphics, because they can play about with them and it's relatively cheap to do so. I'm not complaining. It means I get to replay a lot of my old favourites with updated graphics. Really nice. I enjoy those. That Alex Kidd is one of those games where I really enjoy it, but it's aged quite significantly. It's going to be a difficult sell for a modern platformer fan. Another way of doing the retro revival is to make a unique game that is inspired by an old retro series. A good example of that would be this game, which I've heard people describe as Kaze, whereas I, for some reason, immediately assumed it was pronounced as the Japanese would pronounce it, which would be Kaze. So I've been calling this Kaze and the Wild Masks, but I've heard other people call it Kaze and the Wild Masks, and as I don't know which is the correct way, I'm going to keep calling it Kaze, because that sounds better in my head. I don't know why, but it feels like it fits better, especially as the other character in it is, I believe, called Hojo. The idea of a 2-syllable name for the main character seems to fit better. So I think it's probably supposed to be Kaze. But this game is basically Donkey Kong Country. Only it's Donkey Kong Country with refinements, modern sensibilities in mind, ball-bustingly hard gameplay, like one of the hardest 2D platformers of this style that you'll play, way harder than Donkey Kong Country games, and a real joy to play through. It's fantastically put together. I've been playing that one very recently. I'm almost earning the platinum. I'm only 2 trophies away. And then the last method is, instead of going for the retro market, you can go for the speedrunning market. And again, some of those crossovers. Sonic is very popular amongst the speedrunners, as is Rayman. This game, Splasher, is a great example of a game built from the ground up to appeal to speedrunners. This game is fast and frenetic. It is designed for you to run at extreme speeds and to perfect every movement. One of the things that I think this does better than Kaze is Both of them have a lot of a focus on speedrunning, especially when you're going for the trophies in the other game. But Splasher has a different kind of approach, whereas Kazooie expects you to replay the level over and over again, getting better at the level as you go. Never expecting you to get through it with 0 hits and a speed run time on the first try. You could theoretically do it on this. Very unlikely, but you theoretically could, because Kazooie expects you to replay and memorise some of the level placements to the point where you know what's coming before it comes and you can react accordingly. Whereas Splasher gives you enough range, enough of a zoomed out camera, and enough time to react to your surroundings. It's slightly more like a puzzle game in that regard, in that you're still moving, you're still platforming at speed, but as you're moving through the level, there is rarely a point where an obstacle will arrive and you would have to react to it before you would have the time to notice it, react to it, and intuit how that reaction should be played out in the game on the first try. Like, you can generally do it the first time round if you're skilled enough. I'd say you almost certainly won't, because it's not an easy game. But you theoretically could, that's what I'm saying. And I think that's a better design, but it does limit the game a little, because it means that because the levels are at least somewhat designed to be completable on the first try if you're good enough. Because of that, what you end up with is a game where the levels can never truly test the expert. That they can never be so intense that someone who can platinum the average platformer will be able to play Splasher and truly feel like they are being pushed to their zenith. This isn't Meat Boy. Although Super Meat Boy is another example of the kind of game that Splasher is, only Super Meat Boy is much harder in that regard. Again, can be a good speedrunning game, though Splasher is built around speedrunning. Now, all of these games are 2D platformers, like I say. We've got slightly different approaches to it, but the primary thing that they do is you jump around and you move around a level, going from one place to another, moving on platforms. That is a platformer. You are platforming. You are jumping between platforms. 3D is a little less cut and dry in that regard, though, because 3D platforms, they are much more niche. They are much more restricted. 3D allows for many different interpretations. A run and gun game will be a platformer in 2D, whereas it might be a third-person shooter in 3D, because it makes sense to use the environment to your benefit, to fire your gun, take cover, move out, dodge side to side. You're not going to necessarily be jumping a lot. Whereas you take that same game and put it on a 2D plane, and in order to make it anything more than just running forwards and holding the shoot button, you have to put obstacles in the way, and the most reliable and effective means of manoeuvring around any obstacle in a 2D environment is jumping. So if you've got a 2D plane, you will jump from platform, jump down to another platform, you'll dodge by jumping around and over things, even in a combat game. Hollow Knight, for example, is a platformer. No one's going to deny that you platform in Hollow Knight. And yet, there is a heavy focus on combat. Hollow Knight's combat is probably its biggest focus. If you've ever taken on the Mantis Thorns, you'll know that fight is extremely technical. Especially if you then take on the Sisters of Battle, which is the harder version later on the Pantheons. You can jump around and slash and rebound off their attacks and things like that in order to effectively feel like you're almost dancing with the enemy. And that's great fun. The thing is, if you translate that from 2D to 3D, I don't think you'd get a platformer. I think what you'd get is something along the lines of Bayonetta or Devil May Cry. I think you'd get a spectacle fighter. Because whilst you can jump in the air in Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, it doesn't feel like platforming. It doesn't feel like that's the focus of the game. The focus of the game is manoeuvring around the enemy and fighting them. You can do it without jumping. You don't need to press the jump button, but the jump button is an option for you. Because you can move around a three-dimensional space, you can dodge on the ground. And you can use your swords or your guns or whatever it is that you're fighting with and attack the enemy from various different angles and chain together combinations whilst avoiding their attacks. This is basically what Hollow Knight does, only Hollow Knight, in order to accomplish the proper manoeuvring, requires you to be platforming. For this reason, I think that a lot of games that are often called 3D platformers are not 3D platformers. First example I have is Biomutant. This is unlikely to be a contentious choice. This is not a 3D platformer. You can jump in it, but this is an open world RPG. It is designed to be exactly that. It's your standard open world sandbox. There is a little bit of platforming in it, but not a great deal. There's way more RPG elements. There's a lot more open world elements. There's ranged and melee combat. There's character customization elements. This is one of those every genre games, and it's a great game. It is actually genuinely fun. It was heavily criticised because it was advertised as being like the next big AAA. And in reality, it's probably closer to what the Fable games were on the original Xbox and Xbox 360. That's how it feels to me. It feels like if you took like the post-apocalyptic aesthetic and made a Fable game with anthropomorphic animals and a Saturday morning cartoon-like narrator, which, as a concept, is new and interesting, and they do it very well. I would recommend trying this game out if you're interested in the concept, but I get the impression this is going to get a bad reception and this is going to be downrated a lot by a lot of people who didn't realise what the concept was and was expecting something much more AAA sandbox combat. Something like an open world anthropomorphic Dark Souls or something along those lines. I think there were a fair few people expecting that, and they were disappointed. Which is a shame, because I don't think it's a bad game, I just think it was badly marketed to the wrong people. But anyway, I don't think anyone's going to complain at the idea that Biomutant is not a platformer. The next one I'm going to claim is not a platformer is this. Ratchet & Clank is not a platformer. This is the new one on PS5, Rift Apart. The original, the new original, if that makes sense, on PS4, also not a platformer. The original trilogy on PS2, not platforms. This is a third-person shooter with some jumping in it. Especially late game. At the beginning of the game, you'll spend a bit more time jumping from platform to platform. It'll feel more like a platformer. But the more and more you unlock, the further and further into the game you go, the more and more it focuses on shooting the guns and darting around enemies, often dodging on the ground. I've fought entire boss fights without pressing the jump button once. This is not a platformer. It has platforming in it. This is no more a platformer than Horizon Zero Dawn, or GTA 5, or Infamous Second Son. All of those games have a jump button. All of those games have a world where you can move about. And some of them involve jumping quite extensively. Infamous has actual platforming sections. I would argue so does Horizon Zero Dawn. But they're not platforms. The thing that you have to watch out for when it comes to this kind of classification is, what is the focus of the game? And I would argue this does not qualify. So, if Ratchet & Clank doesn't qualify, then what does? Now, I've only got PlayStation games here as an example. I don't have my Wii U here, and I don't own a Switch, because why would I own a Switch when I already own the Wii U? Almost every game is on the Wii U, or on the PS4 if it's on the Switch. Very few actual games on the Switch, and only on the Switch that I care about. But let's take the Nintendo mascot and put him front and centre. Surely, Mario is a platformer. Mario Odyssey, though? No. Mario Odyssey is not a 3D platformer. Mario Odyssey is a party game. It's a single-player party game. And I say this because while Mario Odyssey does have major moments where you're platforming, it'll have entire level-like structures where you're platforming, especially at the end of the game. At the very end of the game, there are gauntlets which are, if they were their own game, that would be a platformer. There are sections where you'll randomly play a section of 2D platforming, and there are little bits where you'll spend time jumping from platform to platform. But if you actually go back and look at what Mario Odyssey is, it's a scavenger hunt. It's not a platformer. You're not spending your time platforming from one tricky place to another, and the main attraction is not manoeuvring your character from platform to platform. That's not what you're focused on. That's something you might do. But what you actually spend most of your time doing in Mario Odyssey is finding an enemy, throwing your hat at them in order to gain temporary access to a new character with a limited and specialised moveset, and then you figure out a short sequence of things you have to do with that moveset in order to get hold of a moon. That sounds like WarioWare to me. If you boil it down to its main gameplay loop, then consider the other things you do for moons. Run round and collect coins in a circle. Ground pound this bit of floor that's shiny. Go and talk to this NPC. Go and pick up that seed. Take it across the map and drop it in this bucket. These don't involve platforming. I would say if you actually take a 100% playthrough of Super Mario Odyssey and cut out all of the sections where the focus of the gameplay is jumping between platforms where there is a failure condition for not succeeding, where there is a reason why you need to be platforming. If you take all of those sections out, I would say that they would be maybe at most a quarter of the gameplay. There are Mario platforms. All the 2D Mario games, they seem to be platformers. The ones that claim to be platforms. I'm not claiming like Paper Mario as a platformer or Mario RPG as a platform or anything like that. But the 3D Marios, almost none of them are platformers. Not intrinsically. Most of them are scavenger hunts. Most of them are basically a mix of a 3D adventure game and a hidden object game. You know those weird, cheap hidden object games where you control a cursor and you've got to find objects on the picture. You've got to figure out ways that you can manipulate the picture to unlock things. There's loads of them. They're usually the kind of games that sell on PSN for really low because you can get a platinum trophy in them in like 2 hours if you follow a guide, because you just need to know the solutions to find all the hidden objects and then you've won. That's basically what Mario games are. That's what all collect-a-thons are. They are games where the platforming is just one of the means of manoeuvring. You can argue that these are platformers if you want, but by the same logic, that makes things like Burnout Paradise a platformer. Because I'm moving around in an open world, I'm throwing myself off buildings. Admittedly, I'm driving off ramps instead of pressing the jump button, but I'm still moving across buildings. And there are actual sections where you are effectively platforming with your car as you jump off one ramp onto another ramp to get to a billboard. And you are seeking out collectibles. If that's what makes something a platformer, Burnout Paradise is a platformer. Assassin's Creed is a platformer. Every open world game you can think of is a platformer. Spider-Man on PS4 is a platformer. If we have such a restrictive definition, every single game that has a jump button becomes a platformer. Because I would argue Spider-Man on PS4 has way more platforming in it than any Mario game, because you spend a significant amount of your time in that game swinging between buildings and moving between platforms. Like, manoeuvring as Spider-Man is the focus of the game. And yet no one would call it a platformer. Because it's, whilst you still manoeuvre the character, and it is by far the most platformer-focused open world game you can find, it still does not feel like a platformer. And this is where I feel there is a difference. There are 3D platformers, but they're hard to find because there's so few of them. A good example of one that kind of toes the line a bit is this new Super Lucky's Tale. This game is a collect-a-thon, but it's a different kind of collect-a-thon. You still have linear levels, and you're getting from point A to point B. You're just collecting items along the way, and beating the level will unlock an item. Beating the level whilst finding the hidden object in the level will get you another of the items, and beating the level under certain conditions will win you the item, like collecting a set number of things and getting to the end alive, that kind of thing. Doing it in a certain time limit. So this still has linear levels, and those linear levels are the meat and potatoes of the gameplay. As you're moving through those linear levels, you're platforming constantly. This game is the closest thing you can get to a collect-a-thon while still being a platformer in my book. So this counts as a platformer. Spyro the Dragon does not. Spyro the Dragon, you spend way too much time in Spyro, running around, breathing fire on things, rarely actually jumping or moving between platformers. There are huge sections of Spyro where you never leave the ground. So it's not a platformer. The more clear platformer is something like Crash Bandicoot. This is a 3D platformer. And the reason you can tell that this is a 3D platformer is because it plays exactly the same in 2D as it does in 3D. And that's the crux. If you take Mario Odyssey and move it from 3D into 2D, it doesn't suddenly become a 2D platformer. It would instead be impossible to encode. You can't encode running around in a circle to get something. You can't encode the fetch quest nonsense without making it so you now have to jump and do platforming along the way, which you didn't do in the 3D version. Whereas in Crash Bandicoot, all you've done is change the perspective. Instead of going from one side of the screen to the other, you're now going from this part of the screen into the screen, or away from the screen. So you're still moving. Like, all you need to do is just change the perspective by 90 degrees, and there are levels where it actively does that, where you play a 2D-esque level. There are even levels where you move forwards into the screen and then move along a 2D plane, and then move forwards and then move along another 2D plane, then move back towards the screen. At that point, you can see that Crash Bandicoot is exactly what a 3D platformer should be. It is linear, and it is designed around movement. There are others that pull this off, and there are other ways of doing it as well. One that was never really popular, but there are a few games that do it well, was the isometric platformer. One of my favourites is Spot Goes to Hollywood, which no one ever really knows. It was a Sega Saturn game. It was also on PS1, I believe. There was a Mega Drive version, but that one was shite. Don't play that one. That was a really good game, and no one liked it because it was actually a platformer, and platforming in 3D at the time was still fairly new, so every review was complaining that people couldn't get spots to land where they wanted, and they didn't understand the depth perception. They had no real feel for it. I can play through that game without issue. I don't understand what their problem is. But then I've been playing platforms for a long time, and I've got used to 3D movement in games, so maybe it was simply too early in gaming for that game. Maybe if that game had been released more recently, it would get a fairer shake. And I say that because there are a few games that do the isometric camera without making it clear that's what they're doing. And a good example of this is Sackboy. Another good example is Super Mario 3D World. Sackboy and Super Mario both do the same thing. They both have a camera that is fairly zoomed out, and they have most of the level be a plane at an angle to the camera that you're running around on, and you have jumping challenges to perform in a linear level. There's things to collect all around you. It's still very much a collect-a-thon at the same time as being a platform, because you can be both. But because of the way they've got this plane, which is angled towards the camera, you can move around and you can jump around. It's not necessarily going at a 45-degree angle like Spot Goes to Hollywood did, but it can do at times. And a lot of the time, even though you've got this plane, you're still moving from left to right or from right to left, and as you're moving, you can move in and out as well. So it's translating what would have been the 2D jumping into jumping on a plane rather than on a flat dimension. So I think they managed to do platforming beautifully. Really, the issue with 3D platforming, from my perspective, is that 3D is difficult to maneuver in, and it's very, very difficult to make something that is frenetic and fast-paced. Something as fast as Rayman Legends would be almost impossible to make as a 3D platform. It's just not feasible. I'd argue that trying to make a platformer in 3D that is anything close to the speed of Hollow Knight, like the combat in this is some of the fastest combat in gaming. Making something that would approach that, you are guaranteed to end up with a Spectacle Fighter. There's no way that you can make that into a platformer and still maintain a focus on the platforming. You would end up having to make a very technical fighting system, at which point you now have Bayonetta or Devil May Cry. You can make those games very focused on platforming. A good example of that is DMC Devil May Cry, which is basically the style that Hollow Knight is going for in gameplay, not in art direction or anything, obviously. It has huge sections of platforming. It has dream sequences where you're jumping from floating platform to floating platform. Loads of those. One that I do consider a platformer, because I would argue the platforming is more of a focus than the combat, is Alice Madness Returns. That game is very, very focused on the platform. It's one of the few games with a triple jump, which means that you are very, very mobile in the air. And most of the game is based around movement. There is combat, but I would say it's secondary to the platforming. But the difference between the gameplay of Alice Madness Returns and a Devil May Cry game are not that big. I think there's a point where these genres blend, and I find that interesting. I do think the 3D platforming has one method that it can address this with, and that is VR. Astrobot Rescue Mission. This is the best platformer I have ever played, without exception. And it's not because it has expert level design. It's not because it has perfected controls. It's actually not. There is much that can be improved here. They could make the level design more complex. They could make the controls way, way more detailed. They could give you way more options. They could design something far more interesting than what they did here. They did a very traditional platformer. This is the VR equivalent of Crash Bandicoot 1. Whereas Crash Bandicoot 4 makes that game look tired by comparison. We still are yet to see what VR is truly capable of. But what we can see is the issues of three-dimensional gameplay are gone. All third-person games will play better in VR, without exception. It doesn't matter if you're playing Devil May Cry, or if you're playing Assassin's Creed, or if you're playing Gears of War. Actually, maybe not Gears of War, because you would need to be able to aim the gun, which is probably the one thing that you wouldn't be able to do quite as effectively in a VR situation, but anything that uses melee combat, so something like Devil May Cry, Assassin's Creed, etc., they could pull this off quite comfortably. Any 3D platformer, any beat 'em up or anything like that that's in 3D, all of those games would play way better. Even some kinds of racing or sports games would play better in VR from a third-person perspective, because what you have is true 3D. You have everything around you. So you no longer have the issue of the camera being at the wrong angle. You no longer have the issue of depth perception not being clear. It's hard to explain if you've never actually tried it, but if you wear the VR headset and actually look around, you can see that everything feels like you're physically there. You don't need to question how far away everything is, because you instinctively have an idea of how far away it is. And you can see how far Astrobot jumps when you press the jump button. You can see depth. You have full depth perception in this virtual world. And you are sitting in it. You're watching the distance between things. So it is damn near impossible to misjudge a jump in that game. And I love it for that. I think what that has proven to me is that 3D platformers in VR are going to blow all other 3D platformers out of the water. And there is no reason you couldn't theoretically remake any 3D platformer as a VR platformer. If you just remapped it to a VR game, like if you used a VR engine to remap those levels and just moved it so that you could control that character the same way, but instead of having the camera, you moved around in a virtual world. We already know that Astrobot works in both VR and in standard third person, because Astro's Playroom on PS5 is basically the same character moving in the same world, only it's not a VR game. And it works just as well. He controls exactly the same, so there is clearly a one-to-one transfer here. I would argue Astro's Playroom, whilst it's a fun game, is significantly less impressive than Astrobot Rescue Mission, because it's not on VR. They're both great games. This is a better, more complete game because it's not a pack-in tech demo. It's longer and has way more to it. But they're still both fantastic games. What Astro's Playroom proves, though, is that if it wasn't a VR game, Astrobot Rescue Mission would be a decent 3D platformer. Being in VR, it's the best I've yet played. This would be up there if it was just flat on your TV 3D. The level design is still really good. The art direction is charming. The controls are really nice to use, and the design elements are very fun. But I do think that the VR integration is what makes it beautiful. So, now I've described all the different types of platformers. I've described what I like about a few games. Why do I prefer platformers to other games, and why is it that if you check, like if you've been a member of my Discord for any time, if you've had me on social media, or if you've read any of the posts I've made on Reddit, you will see that I regularly say that I don't consider platformers to be video games. I consider them to be a different medium. And that's a very hard statement to make, and the reason I say that is I think video game is too reductive a term. I think to say this is a video game is to say something like this is a television program. It's on par with that statement. A show like Breaking Bad or True Blood or Game of Thrones, those are television programs. But so is the news or the Premier League or a documentary about birds. So is a stand-up comedy sketch or a Bugs Bunny cartoon. So would be any Hollywood film. But no film buff would review a Bugs Bunny cartoon, or would review the evening news, or would review Lee Evans' latest stand-up comedy sketch. They don't consider themselves to be the same thing. Televised sport is not considered to be in the same category as reality TV, which isn't considered to be even close to a Hollywood film. When someone says they're a film buff, they like films. No one asks them what their opinion of Wimbledon was, or the Grand National horse race. Because why would they care? Why would they ask that? And that's my position. I consider video games to be such a wide medium at this point that it's not just different genres. A first-person shooter and a 2D platformer are not different genres, they're different mediums. They are as different from each other as a wildlife documentary and a Bugs Bunny cartoon. They're not the same thing. And I think that the most obvious difference is that platformers are focused primarily on the gameplay. You don't need a storyline in a platformer. Mario saves the princess from the giant fire-breathing snapping turtle because that's what he does. Sonic runs through and smashes the fat guy that looks like an egg, and frees the animals from the weird robot prison. There's no real sense behind any of it. Rayman is a disembodied body with floating hands and shoes that moves through a drug-induced dream world in order to catch faces with wings. It's nonsense. Donkey Kong rolls around in a jungle because he wants his magic banana horde back. These plots fit on a post-it note. They're not storylines. They're conceptions. All this is a concept. All it is an excuse to have a game. So what we end up with is a framing device. And that's fine. That's all we really need. The level design, the gameplay, the controls, the flow, the kinesthetic appeal is what platformers are all about. And my position is that platformers are closer to music than any other medium. And I'm going to justify this. If you're playing your way through a game like Sonic or Rayman, and Rayman is a fantastic example of this precisely because you can go and look at the music levels where you literally jump in time with music as music plays throughout the level, and the level reacts to the music, and you're practically jumping in time with the music. When you play through a platformer, you're not playing through a game where you're making decisions to affect the story. You're not concerned about the characters' motivations. You're not trying to construct a narrative. You are just trying to beat the challenge. And the challenge is nothing more than pressing the buttons in the correct order in order to make the character get from point A to point B. So you can consider all the button presses to be equivalent to notes played on a musical instrument. In fact, if you watch someone very competently speedrunning their way through any platformer, and then watch someone else doing the same thing, they will be making very, very similar movements. Which means that they are very much equivalent to two people playing the same bit of music on a musical instrument. Where I would say they differ in one regard, though, is if they were exactly the same, they would just be rhythm games. Guitar Hero is not a platformer. Because in Guitar Hero, if you're playing Guitar Hero, each track has one and only one precise order of notes you can play. Like you take the guitar, you press whatever buttons. You've got to press exactly those buttons for exactly that time in exactly that order to pass with a perfect rating. Sonic doesn't have that. In order to get the world record speedrun, you basically need to match button press for button press with the current world record because they've optimized to the point of ridiculousness. But if we ignore the top end of speedrunning for just a moment, and we look at just beating the level with a level of competency and a high score, then it plays closer to freeform jazz. Imagine you've got a saxophone and you're playing along, and you've got to keep a rhythm and a beat. You've got to keep to a certain tone, melody, but the notes you play in exactly what order is entirely up to you. And you can, You can go off in one direction, a twiddly bit here and a twiddly bit there, and you can do it your way. And that's how platformers feel. You can jump up on these bricks, so you can go down here, you can spin over this bit, you can bounce off that enemy, you can wall jump up this area and jump over that. And how you navigate the level, especially in linear levels that are open enough to have multiple different directions or approaches. Sonic is a fantastic example of this. There is many, many different ways of getting from the beginning to the end in any level of a Sonic game. They can be vastly different. The way that you get through Green Hill Zone may be very different from the way I get through Green Hill Zone. Now, there is an optimum path through Green Hill Zone, and if you watch a speedrun, you'll find that the optimum path has been very, very carefully discovered. But there are many other different paths, very different paths. So much so, in fact, that because the speedrunners have only practiced the optimum path, if you try and take them along the upper path or the lower path rather than going through the optimum path, they will be shit at it because they've not practiced that bit. They don't know where the platforms are going to be. They don't know exactly how to space their jumps out. Whereas you may find that you've never played the optimum path. You always took the top route. So maybe the guy doing the optimum path, maybe he's not brilliant. He's not a world-ranked speedrunner. But he knows, he's watched it on YouTube. He knows what the optimum path is, so he's going to take that path. But you've taken the top path, and that was the path you always played. So you play that top path. Maybe you beat it. Maybe you get a higher score, or you beat the level in a better time. That's the freeform nature of a platformer. And I feel that there is a lot of fun to be had. It's not like listening to music. It's like playing music. It's like being part of a one-person orchestra where the rest of it is automated for you. The graphics, the sound, the control scheme is all in aid of you being able to, with the buttons in your hand, play a movement-based equivalent of music. And now that I've described it that way, you can see why, when I look at games, I consider things like Crash Bandicoot to count. Because of how you move through the levels, because of how you bounce from box to box, from enemy to enemy, how every level is designed so that you can speedrun your way through them when you're good enough. In fact, there are relics based around speedrunning each level. You can always tell a platformer that it's designed to allow that kind of freedom because the levels will usually have a speedrun mode. If they don't, that's a rarity because that's the aim of the platform, is to get better and better at the platform until once you've played it many, many times, speedrunning is the only way it challenges you anymore because you know the levels inside and out. But it's still fun to go back and play it. You can still casually play through Donkey Kong Country, or you can casually play through Sonic the Hedgehog and enjoy them. And those older games, they don't have speedrun modes. But if you look at Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and Sonic Mania, what do they have? Speedrun modes. Rayman, speedrun mode. Crash Bandicoot, speedrun mode. Kazooie, speedrun mode. Even Hollow Knight has a speedrun trophy on the Steam version. And it doesn't even have levels. Like, the only way that you don't have that speedrun thing is when the game itself isn't level-based. When, for example, you're playing something that is exploration-based. And even then, there is usually a speedrun community around it. Because the game still lends itself to that mentality. Now look at Mario Odyssey. Yes, you can speedrun it, and plenty of people will, because it's a mainline Mario game, and those games get speedrun communities all the time. Like Legend of Zelda has a speedrun community. It doesn't make it a platform. The thing is, it's not based around successfully performing the platforming as best you can. Most of the time shaving is on manipulating the various different tasks you need to do to try and make them complete as fast as possible. You try and shave seconds off by inputting inputs in such a way that the conversations go faster, or you can collect moons that require you to do busy work faster by manipulating the system. A lot of them rely on glitches in order to get things moving along as fast as they can. and it's interesting to see the different mentality. So yeah, that's what I think of platformers. It's why I have a very strict definition of what I consider a 3D platformer, and it's one of my favourite mediums. I think that platformers are immensely fun. It is the closest you can get to playing a musical instrument without it being auditory based. It's a movement and visual equivalent of music, and it's a bizarre and fresh pastime that I think is fundamentally different from other games. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that games like Mario Odyssey have no value. I'm saying they have no real value as a platformer. That doesn't mean they're not fun games. If you want to play a hidden object game where you don't have a static image, where you instead have a world to explore, then Mario Odyssey is the perfect game for you. So is the Zelda games. Zelda games are basically the same kind of thing. You spend most of your time exploring. It's an adventure game. You spend most of your time exploring, trying to find different things. I would say the difference between Mario Odyssey and most 3D Zelda games is very minimal. And Zelda games, most of them didn't even have a jump button. They had an automated jump when jump was necessary. And that's the difference, I'd say. If you want an exploration adventure where the aim of the game is to get lost in an open world and just see what you can find, that thrill of exploration, then sure, I don't find that interesting. I don't want to be exploring unless that exploring is built into a platformer, as it is in something like Hollow Knight. Because in Hollow Knight, I enjoy the moving around as I'm exploring. I enjoy the combat, which is also very movement heavy. So there is enough platforming surrounding everything that exploring every corner and smashing every wall and seeing where things are still is fun for me. Do you know what I would find more fun, though? If you took Hollow Knight's control scheme and made a linear game where I had linear level progressions and then a boss encounter every 5 levels. If you made that game, literally just Hollow Knight, just take that character, take those level designs, and just make a series of linear levels out of them, and then stick a boss fight after every 5th level, that would be a better game for me. I would prefer that game. Because not only could I get the platforming experience, I would get the thrill of the combat, I would also be able to fight my way through, learn the level layouts, and then speedrun those levels. And that would be even more fun for me. One thing that you do have on Hollow Knight is you have the Pantheons, which is where you fight a set number of bosses in order. Now, those are combat encounters, but because the combat in Hollow Knight is so platforming heavy, they are almost like linear levels, because you're fighting boss after boss after boss in a small arena. That's not too bad, actually. I really enjoy that mode. I'm not very good at it. I wish I was. I would have the platinum by now if I did. If I was good at it. I mean, it's very, very hard, so. It's one I would like to get at one point, but I may never be able to achieve it. Hollow Knight is ridiculously difficult at the highest level. But yeah, I would love to see a linear interpretation of the Hollow Knight formula. The combat is so incredible that if you took that and you made really inventive linear levels that followed through a progression to set bosses, yes, it would lose some of the freedom and some of the exploration elements that other players enjoy, but I feel that me as a linear platforming fan would get way more out of it. So yeah, that's where I fall on platforming, and I feel that it doesn't undermine video games. I still love video games. I still enjoy playing Devil May Cry and Horizon Zero Dawn. I play racing games like Need for Speed and Burnout. I've played so many different video games. I don't tend to play first-person shooters. For some reason, they give me motion sickness. But I play RPGs all the time. I love RPGs. I love I love games like Diablo. Diablo was one of my favourites for a good long time. I like strategy games. The Civilization series has been a long time favourite. I enjoy games like Tropico and Europa Universalis. Those are fantastic games. But even then, like, would you compare the Civilization or the Europa Universalis games like Paradox games? The kind of strategy games they put out, are they really the same thing as a third-person action game like Uncharted? Are they even close? I don't think they are. I would say a strategy game like Civilization is as far removed from a platformer as it is from something like Tomb Raider or The Last of Us, or Horizon Zero Dawn. Those kinds of games are just different. Like, there's no real narrative in those strategy games either. I would argue there are multiple different mediums here. The video games isn't just one thing. It's like saying TV programs. I'm a fan of TV programs. Oh right, did you watch Wimbledon? No, I watched Breaking Bad. Well, we've got nothing in common then. Do you see how this lies? It's the same thing. If someone likes grand strategy games and another person likes Dark Souls, they have nothing in common. The person playing Galactic Civilizations and the person playing Dark Souls 3 has nothing in common. Their games are not even remotely similar. They are about as close as someone who watched Brokeback Mountain and someone who watched the World Snooker Championships. There is no connection. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope I've given people something to ponder. It's been an interesting discussion, and that's an insight into what I love about platformers and why I love them and how I think of them. And I'd be interested to see if other people agree. And do you agree? Do you like my analogy of considering like a movement and visual version of freeform jazz? Because that's how I view a really well-made linear platformer that's got a high skill ceiling. And I would love to know if other people see it the same way. So until then, I'll see you next time. And it's been fun. Hopefully the eye heals soon, because I don't want to have to explain this in every video, but I'm going to have to. I know. Anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.